When an HOA busybody spotted my wife unloading hay at our ranch barn, she decided it was her mission to protect the neighborhood. She called the cops, hoping to humiliate us. What she didn't realize was that my wife wasn't just any woman, she was the newly appointed police chief. Life in our quiet ranch community had always been a delicate balance between peace and friction. A place where neighbors knew one another's habits, yet sometimes forgot the boundaries of respect. And it was within this simmering dynamic that my wife and I had chosen to plant roots, purchasing a century-old ranch just beyond the polished rows of houses controlled by an overzealous homeowners association. The ranch came with history, weathered barns, creaky fences, and the smell of sun-baked earth that clung to boots. But it also came with freedom, something my wife cherished after years of dealing with tight-knit city politics. My wife, Elena, had spent decades serving the police force, rising through the ranks not just because of her badge, but because of her relentless integrity, a woman who didn't bend to pressure and never let corruption steer her path. And though her new role as police chief had only been announced days earlier, we hadn't yet told many of our neighbors, preferring to settle in quietly, focus on restoring the barn, and enjoy the rare stillness of mornings spent sipping coffee on the porch. Unfortunately, peace and stillness were luxuries that people like Karen couldn't stomach, and she lived just at the edge of the HOA's reach, a self-appointed guardian of neighborhood appearances who prided herself on patrolling with a clipboard in one hand and her phone in the other, dialing authorities for the smallest of infractions. For weeks she had been watching us, scrutinizing the hay deliveries, the late-night lights in the barn when we worked on repairs, the tractors pulling into the gravel driveway, as though our way of life was an affront to her carefully curated suburban standards. On the morning it all came to a head, Elena had pulled her hair into a messy bun, rolled up the sleeves of her faded denim shirt, and hauled bales of hay into the barn with practiced strength, while I carried lumber for a new stall divider. From across the fence, I spotted Karen glaring, arms folded, lips pinched as if our sweat was somehow a violation of HOA aesthetics. She shouted something about zoning laws, but we ignored her, knowing well enough that the ranch was exempt from HOA rules. That truth, however, didn't fit into her narrative of control. Within minutes, she was on the phone, voice raised in faux urgency, claiming there were suspicious people unloading contraband at the barn, a wild accusation even for her. We heard her shrill words carried on the breeze, and I rolled my eyes, muttering under my breath that she'd lost it this time, but Elena only smirked, unbothered. Unbothered, the corners of her eyes crinkling in that way they did whenever she was holding back laughter. Soon enough, the flashing lights of patrol cars broke the calm of the dirt road, gravel crunching under tires as two officers stepped out, hands already on their belts, scanning the property as if preparing for confrontation. Karen pranced behind them, waving dramatically, pointing at my wife like she was unveiling a criminal. "That's her! She's been running operations out of that barn!" she exclaimed with a smug tone, clearly expecting the officers to storm in, cuff Elena, and deliver her some twisted sense of victory. The officers approached, stern, commanding us to stop what we were doing, and I could feel my irritation boiling, but Elena, calm as ever, set down the bale of hay, dusted her hands, and walked toward them with the steady stride of authority. She asked them politely what the problem was, her voice even, professional, but they repeated Karen's wild claims about illegal activity, almost embarrassed but bound by protocol to at least ask. The moment stretched like taut rope, the officers clearly unsure of how to proceed, until Elena reached into her pocket, pulled out her badge, and flipped it open with deliberate grace. The sunlight caught the gleam of the polished metal as she said, "Chief Elena Marquez, newly appointed head of this county's police department. Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" Silence fell like a hammer. The two officers froze, their confident postures collapsing into stunned disbelief, and Karen's smug grin shattered as though she'd been doused with cold water. One officer stammered, trying to regain composure, muttering an apology, while the other instinctively straightened into a salute, recognizing that the woman he'd nearly accused was now his commanding officer. Elena's expression didn't harden, didn't gloat. She simply raised a brow, waiting, her silence speaking volumes. Karen sputtered, insisting this was a mistake, that surely Elena was impersonating someone, but the officers quickly shut her down, verifying her credentials through their radios, and within moments the air was thick with awkward respect. The shift was instant. The officers turned from skeptical interrogators to deferential subordinates, while Karen's face drained of color, her eyes darting as though searching for an escape. Elena, however, didn't let the moment pass without a lesson. Calling in false reports wastes resources, she told Karen firmly, her voice carrying the weight of authority but also the steadiness of someone who'd seen far worse than a nosy neighbor. Next time, before you weaponize 911 for your personal vendettas, remember that the law applies to everyone, even you. Karen stammered, tried to backpedal, mumbling something about just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. But Elena's gaze cut through her excuses, making clear that her antics had not only failed, but had exposed her for the petty, power-hungry neighbor she was. The officers, eager to disengage from Karen's theatrics, apologized again to Elena and offered to file a report against Karen for misuse of emergency services, though Elena, ever composed, declined to escalate the situation, knowing that humiliation was punishment enough for someone like Karen. As the patrol cars pulled away, their lights dimming against the horizon, Karen stood frozen in her driveway, the clipboard in her hand trembling. Her reign of petty terror cracked irreparably. Elena returned to the barn, lifted the bale as if nothing had happened, and looked at me with that mischievous smile that always made me fall for her all over again. "Well," she said, chuckling, "that's one way to introduce myself to the neighborhood." We laughed, the tension dissolving, and I knew right then that life in this ranch community would never quite be the same again. Not because of Karen's interference, but because the people now knew exactly who my wife was, and that the days of bullying, false reports, and HOA harassment had met a force far greater than they could handle. From that day forward, the barn stood taller, not just as a symbol of our labor, but as a reminder that truth always outlasts pettiness, and that sometimes the best justice isn't about arrests or fines. It's about watching arrogance crumble under the weight of reality. And that's how one HOA Karen's call backfired in the most unexpected way. My wife wasn't just unloading hay, she was the new police chief. Sometimes the loudest voices crumble when the truth steps forward. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Hidden Compass Stories, where real drama meets powerful endings.